20 years ago this week, Brad Siegel, the president of Turner Programming, sent a memo to staff on the morning of March 16th, 2001, 2 days before WCW's Greed pay-per-view, which would turn out to be its last. It did a whopping 50,000 buys. That memo reads as follows. In early January, we told you about an agreement that we had reached to sell WCW and its related assets. At that time, we said that we would apprise you of any changes to the way WCW operates. Effective Tuesday, March 27, WCW programming will begin a period of hiatus. During this hiatus, WCW will review its programming plans and determine the course of future WCW branded entertainment events. On Wednesday, March 28th, please plan to attend an all-staff meeting at 10 a.m. at the power plant, at which time we will share with you further information regarding WCW plans. In the meantime, I hope that you will maintain the level of professionalism that distinguishes our organization, particularly as we prepare for the upcoming Panama City, Florida event. Thank you. In reality, there was no planned hiatus. And by that afternoon, TBS announced that it would no longer air professional wrestling on its stations after nearly 30 years of doing so. This was the day that WCW truly died. This was the move that sealed the company's fate. It wouldn't become official for another week, but this was the move that really was the death knell for WCW. Jamie Kellner, in his first major act as CEO of Turner Broadcasting, canceled all WCW programming on TNT and TBS effective after the March 26th spring break episode of Nitro from Panama City Beach, killing any chance of Fusion Media. That was the company that had the pending sale. They were going to be the ones buying WCW. They were working with Eric Bischoff. This is the move that killed any possibility of that Fusion sale going through. Fusion, with Bischoff, had already announced in January its plans to buy the company, but they jumped the gun in doing so. Upon looking at the books a little bit closer, Fusion realized what a shit show this company really was. When they really scrutinized the books and the finances a little bit better, they realized, wow, this company is an even bigger money loser than we thought. And they lowered their planned purchase price from what would have been $75 million down to less than 50. And I think it dropped even lower than that until Kellner came in, and he was no fan of pro wrestling, and he made the move to cancel their TV slots, and that killed the entire deal. Bischoff got the call from somebody at Fusion giving him the news while he was on the beach that the deal was off. And the signed letter of intent was voided because without those TV time slots, the company had no real value to them. Per the March 26, 2001 issue of the Wrestling Observer, plans had already been made internally at Turner the year before, in 2000, to get wrestling off of TNT, because TNT was going to go through this whole rebranding. Wrestling did not fit the upscale vision, I guess, for whatever their new programming vision was for the network. And the decision had already been made, even if Bischoff and them didn't know about it. That was going to happen in April. The idea is that Nitro would have moved to Monday nights on TBS, but once Kellner made the call to cancel Nitro and Thunder, it didn't matter. A spokesman for TBS told the New York Times, basically, we've decided that professional wrestling in its current incarnation is not consistent with the upscale brands that we have built at TNT and TBS. Therefore, we will not be carrying it. End quote. A few days later on Nitro, Eric Bischoff called into the show, and it sounded like he was giving the eulogy at his own funeral. He said, many of you may know that for the past 6 months, I've been working with a group of people whose goal it was and is to acquire World Championship Wrestling and to grow it once again to become a competitive, dominant wrestling organization worldwide. But recently, we've hit a couple of roadblocks that may, in fact, be brick walls. He sounded like a defeated man because he knew he was. And just like that, there are plans for a Big Bang pay-per-view in the month of May where everything would just effectively be rebooted. It would be like a hard reset for the company. They would start anew, fresh start for the company under new ownership. All those plans just went up in smoke. And we all know what happened next. But that's for me to cover on next week's history segment. I told you this was a busy time. I told you there's a lot going on these couple of months here, 20 years ago. A lot of shit going down. WWE had already been in negotiations at the end of 2000 to buy WCW. They hit a wall because of the shows airing on Turner Networks. I think it had to do with WWE shows airing on Viacom. This was after they'd already moved from USA to TNN. And so I think with their programming on the Viacom-owned stations, they just weren't allowed. They weren't permitted to make the deal, even though they wanted to. That's the only reason Vince McMahon didn't snatch up WCW sooner than he did. If they would have allowed that to happen, he would have had them lock, stock, and barrel probably by the, I'd say, late fall, beginning of winter. But now with TNT and TBS out of the way, that paved the way for him to swoop right in and pick the bones. 19 years ago this week, on March 17th, 2002, WrestleMania 18 took place at the Sky Dome in Toronto, Canada, the first time WrestleMania left the US since 1990, which took place in that very same building. It was also the final WrestleMania to use the WWF initials. Toronto was Hogan country. They loved Hulk Hogan in his match with the Ultimate Warrior all those years earlier. They liked the Warrior too, but it was more of a split crowd than this show was, I can tell you that. Don't tell that to Jim Ross, though, who tried his damnedest to convince us that the crowd was split evenly in its support for Hollywood Hogan and The Rock. That was a lie. But it was one of the biggest matches in WrestleMania history. It was dubbed Icon versus Icon, and one of my 3 favorite WrestleMania matches of all time, along with Bret Hart and Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13, and Shawn Michaels against The Undertaker at WrestleMania 25. Hogan had just returned to the company he helped build after a 9-year absence as part of the NWO, and they did everything to get over his heels. They tried to have Hogan murder The Rock by hitting him in the head with a hammer. They had him get into a truck, a Mack truck, an 18-wheeler, and ram into an ambulance that same night that had The Rock inside. He tried to kill this man. Didn't matter. When Hogan got to Toronto, he was like a returning hero, a beloved hero. They could tell that weekend, the day before. They had fan access type events and everything, so the company knew. They could tell that the fan support for Hogan was in full force. I don't know when their plans for how the match would go. I mean, Hogan claims that they had to change mid-match, but it's Hogan. You've got to take what Hogan says with a mound of salt. I don't believe that they called an audible in the middle of the match. They knew that weekend. They could tell by the fan reaction that weekend that the fans were in Hogan's camp. They knew he was going to be the babyface in that match. And so they worked it masterfully. I think Hogan still had juice as a heel. It was definitely too soon to do the turn. They'd just come back, and they came in as heels. But they gave the people what they wanted to see. They gave them the big Hulk up spot during the match, and the place came unglued. If you go back and watch it, you could even see Dustin Diamond, Screech, from Saved by the Bell in those first few rows, cupping his hand to his ear and marking out and going nuts during the Hulk up. I know he just passed away recently. Did Dustin Diamond. He was a big wrestling fan. When Hogan dropped the big leg on Rock, Jim Ross had one of the... I truly believe this is one of his greatest calls. I don't want to sit here and say the greatest, because everybody will think of the stuff from the Hell in a Cell with Undertaker and Mankind. But if it isn't his greatest, it's up there as one of his top 3 or 4 greatest lines. Just in terms of the line, when he hit the line, it was so perfect. Hogan does the whole Hulk up routine. He gives Rock a big boot to the face. People are losing their minds. They know what's coming up next. And Hogan hits the ropes and he comes off with the big leg drop. And Jim Ross, as Hogan goes for the cover, starts screaming he beat Andre the Giant with that move. It was so perfect. And you thought in that moment that they were going to give it to Hogan, but then Rock kicked out. This was probably the point, I'm guessing, where Triple H was throwing furniture in the back, realizing that he and Chris Jericho were fucked in the main event. Rock won the match. He and Hogan shook hands after Hall and Nash came out, beat up Hogan, breaking the NWO up a month after they debuted. And just like that, Hogan was a babyface again. The only thing that could have made this better is playing real American while he posed at the very end. Also on this show, Edge and Booker T wrestled over a Japanese shampoo commercial. It was originally going to be hair versus hair. Booker T told the story on his Hall of Fame podcast. He said Bruce Pritchard, who he's very good friends with, Bruce Pritchard came to him and he pitched the idea of a hair match. Hey, Book, what do you think about doing a hair match with Edge? And Booker asks him, he goes, is Edge cutting his hair? Because I'm not cutting mine. And Pritchard said, okay, we'll figure something out. And he said he shut that shit down right away. Instead, WWE used the hair stipulation for Edge's feud right after this against Kurt Angle. The Undertaker went 10-0 at WrestleMania with a win over Ric Flair. Undertaker had sort of been forgotten about. He fell through the cracks, believe it or not, when it came to putting this card together, and Vince McMahon was very apologetic. He talked about this, Undertaker did, in the Broken Skull sessions, one of the two, that he did with Steve Austin on the network not too long ago. And he said Vince gave him the option of wrestling two people. Gave him the choice. He goes, you could have Flair at WrestleMania, or you could have Rob Van Dam. Undertaker said he jumped at the chance to wrestle Flair. And this shocked Vince McMahon. I assume it shocked him because he thought that maybe he would want to face somebody newer and younger. And Undertaker's logic was, look, I got nothing against RVD. He probably barely even knew RVD at that point. I don't think they had worked together yet. He says, I'm going to have plenty of chances to wrestle Rob Van Dam. But how many more chances am I going to have to wrestle the Nature Boy at WrestleMania? Stone Cold Steve Austin wrestled Scott Hall on the undercard and was not too happy about it, but it's hard to have much sympathy for him when it's been said that he turned down the chance to wrestle Hulk Hogan on this show. That would have been the biggest possible match they could have done. But Austin had no interest in working with Hogan at that time. And also the fact that Austin was originally penciled into the main event of that year's show. Seth Mates is a name you probably haven't heard of. Some of you may have heard. Seth Mates is a former writer for WWE many years ago. And years ago, he used to write a blog on Newsday.com. Newsday is a newspaper here in New York, primarily out on Long Island. But it's one of the three major New York newspapers. And he did a blog on the Newsday website at that time. And he wrote in this blog many years ago that the original plan for WrestleMania 18 was for Austin to hold the WWF title all the way to WrestleMania that year as a heel. So don't turn back babyface, stay as a heel. Right? He had turned the year before at WrestleMania. Austin goes into 18 as the champion. Triple H makes his big comeback from injury as a babyface, and Austin drops the title to Triple H at WrestleMania 18. I guess blaming him for, maybe Austin would blame him and his injury for the breakup of the two-man power trip, and Triple H would come back and he would try to get the title away from Austin. He had beaten Austin in the 3 Stages of Hell match the year before, so if they wanted to really go all the way back, even before the two-man power trip began, there was plenty of history there for them to point to, but that was the plan according to him. It was going to be Austin and Triple H would beat Austin and become the champion. Well, Austin realized in late 2001 that his heel turn was not working to his liking, and he wanted to go back to being a babyface. So as soon as the Alliance lost its Survivor Series, and that was the end of the Invasion angle, thank God, put that fucking thing out of its misery. What a botch job that was. The very next night on Raw, Austin became a babyface again. But that was his choice. He chose to go back to being a babyface. So plans for heel Austin against babyface Triple H fell through. They went right out the window. Otherwise, he would have been in the main event, defending the title. So, I mean, really, what else was there for him to do on this show, right? I mean, you think about it, the two scenarios that have been floated, if in fact they're legitimate, was either a match with Hogan, which did not need a title. I mean, that would have been the biggest match, one of the biggest matches in the history of that company. Or defending the championship in the main event. And it sounds as if he, through his own actions or whatever, put the kibosh on both those ideas. So, I mean, what else was there for him to do? Really, if you think about it. I mean, Kevin Nash was in Scott Hall's corner for the event. I believe that was because there was concern that Hall might not make it to the event. Scott Hall had a lot of issues at that time. And there were a lot of people, they were probably taking bets in the back about whether or not Hall would even make it to WrestleMania without getting fired or ending up in rehab or something like that. So I think the idea was if Hall fucks up and doesn't make it to Mania for the match with Austin, we got to keep Nash out of a match. If we have to, then we can slide Nash into the match with Austin. Because it was always very weird. Why would Hall have a match, Hogan has a match, and Kevin Nash is just standing there? It never really made a lot of sense. That does, though. When you think about it in those terms, at least they have some big name they could slot in there if they have to. And if not, then whatever, he's in, at least he's on the show. At least he's in Scott Hall's corner. But anyway, if you were taking bets on whether or not Scott Hall would fuck up either before Mania or after Mania, if you had your money on after Mania, then you're a winner. Because he didn't last much longer after that. I think within a couple of months he was gone. Austin, very unhappy with his creative, despite winning at WrestleMania, walked out on the company the very next night. But he returned 2 weeks later. He walked out again in June. That was for quite a bit longer. And Triple H, fresh off of his big comeback from his first quad tear and his big Royal Rumble victory, beat Chris Jericho to become undisputed champion after a horrendous storyline build that focused more on the animus between husband and wife or ex-husband and wife, Triple H and Stephanie, than it did Triple H and Jericho. Jericho was just like a backdrop. The WrestleMania main event that year should have been Triple H against Stephanie McMahon, and Chris Jericho could have been the guest enforcer outside the ring. That's kind of what this felt like going into the match. By the way, part of the wonderful storyline stuff between Triple H and Stephanie heading into this big WrestleMania main event involved custody of Triple H's beloved bulldog. So beloved, I didn't no mention ever before that Triple H even had a dog. But all of a sudden, it's like his most prized possession, this beloved bulldog named Lucy, who got run over by a car as part of this wonderful storyline. On Raw the next night in Montreal, Brock Lesnar made his television debut. He interfered in a hardcore title match between Maven and Al Snow. And with him, at his side in his corner, making his first appearance in 4 months since literally being carried out of the building on Raw, kicking and screaming, was one Paul Heyman. And these two have been inseparable ever since. Except for that one time, I guess, where Heyman turned on him on TV. But these two have been inseparable ever since. Heyman and Lesnar, they go together like peanut butter and jelly. 10 years ago this week, on March 18th, 2011, Chuck Ross posted a blog on the website tvweek.com talking about a comical exchange that he had with a WWE publicist who emailed him demanding that they correct a story they posted with the headline, Drew Carey inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. WWE had sent him a press release announcing that Drew Carey would be inducted into their celebrity wing of the Hall of Fame. So, they wrote a story based off the release that they received. Well, This sent the publicist off the deep end. Not only did she email Chuck Ross, she CC'd the site's owner on the email. She CC'd Chuck Ross's boss on the email, which is just a dick thing to do, by the way. See, I'm in public relations too. So I can see things from the point of view of the publicist. This woman was only doing what she was asked to do, and you are occasionally working with clients who have crazy requests that, even though you think, God, this is ridiculous, you still work on behalf of the client. So I get it. I to that extent, I understand and I can sympathize with her plight. I can only hope that even she realized how fucking dumb this was. So I get it. But still, CCing the owner or the editor or whatever, trying to get the person in trouble, dick move. Dick move. But her beef was this. WWE is no longer a wrestling company. WWE is a global entertainment company with a movie studio, international licensing deals, not one, not two, but 3 magazines at the time they had. Now they have none. But at the time, they had 3 different magazines. From the reporter's perspective, their headline was completely accurate. There was nothing wrong with it. And the reporter was actually offended by their demand that it be changed. And I can understand that too. So they get on the phone. And he transcribed their conversation, which was hilarious. He said, listen, your press release says that Drew Carey was an entrant in the 2001 Royal Rumble. I believe that was a wrestling event. And the publicist says, no, we don't do wrestling events. They're entertainments. And we don't call them wrestlers. They're superstars and divas. You know, as a fan, I can live with calling them superstars. Vince McMahon has been calling them superstars since I was a kid. So I'm used to it by now. That's not a big deal, right? I can live with that. And I can live with the term sports entertainment. Even though you can see Steve Austin, a piece of his soul dies a little bit each time on the inside when he's forced to say that whenever he's on the network, like when he interviewed Vince McMahon, right? But I draw the line at entertainments. What the fuck is that? I have never in my life heard of an event called an entertainment. We do entertainments. Hey, WWE has 2 entertainments coming to town. Let's go buy tickets. At that point, he tells the woman, look, I don't have time for this. WWE presents wrestling events. I'm not changing the headline. If you want, I can just remove the whole story. What do you want me to do? And with that, she told him to remove it, and that was that. And so instead of getting some publicity and some press for Drew Carey going into their Hall of Fame, instead, they got no story out of it, and they got a blog talking about how stupid they are. Thankfully, this entertainments stuff didn't catch on, because I've never seen or heard them use that word ever since. And unless they're under the influence of narcotics, they should never entertain the idea of using it ever again. 13 years ago this week, on March 15, 2008, Jim Ross posted a blog on his website talking about Jeff Hardy's home burning to the ground the night before in North Carolina, losing almost everything he owned and his dog Jack, who perished in the blaze, which was later incorporated into a WWE storyline where I believe his brother Matt took credit for the fire, and thus killing Jeff's dog. At the time, Jeff was serving a 60-day suspension for his second violation of the wellness policy. Thankfully, Jeff was not at home at the time of the fire. JR had this to say about what happened. So the fallout of the 60-day suspension for Jeff Hardy for a second violation of the WWE wellness policy is still making news. Sadly, Friday night, Jeff's home in North Carolina burned to the ground, and he lost essentially everything he had, and most sadly, his dog. Losing an animal is just like losing a family member to many people, and we experienced that with the death of our 18-year-old cat Molly, who had to be put down after suffering a series of strokes. Apparently, Matt Hardy saw smoke coming from Jeff's home Friday night, discovered that no one was home, but arrived at the house too late to do anything but watch it burn to the ground. These are challenging times for Jeff, to say the least. Not only has he incurred his second strike with only one remaining before he would be terminated from WWE, his situation has been underscored by the fact that his suspension went public per the policy which went into effect in November, and with which I wholeheartedly agree. Now Jeff's home has been destroyed, with the heartbreaking reality that his beloved dog died in the fire as well. Jeff's career can be rebuilt if he so chooses to committing to doing as much. This commitment cannot be a short-term commitment, but a lifetime commitment that must see him take it one day at a time and have the express goal of being successful in 24-hour intervals. I am one that truly believes that Jeff can make this happen, especially if those close to him offer Jeff the kind of support that he needs and that he seeks the wisdom and advice of a counselor who can help Jeff understand why these life and career-threatening mistakes are being made. Days later on his MySpace page, remember MySpace? Matt Hardy had this to say about that terrible day. As I pulled around the lake that bordered Jeff's home, I witnessed a horrific mental image that will always be etched in my mind. I could see over Jeff's recording studio that my brother's home was engulfed in flames. I violently stopped my car, jumped out, and ran towards Jeff's burning home, yelling for my brother at the top of my lungs. My initial fear was that Jeff and Beth were burning to death inside the house. And I was the only person on the scene. I was frantic. I ran onto the front porch, kicked at the flaming front door, yelling for Jeff and Beth. I could only stay there for a second. The temperature of the heat was unbearable, and I couldn't breathe due to the smoke and lack of oxygen. The entire structure was covered in flames. I ran to the other side of Jeff's place and saw that his car was gone. I internally prayed that Jeff, Beth, and Jack were not in there. I jumped in my car and raced back to my home to get my phone. I got home and called Jeff. It went straight to voicemail and my heart dropped. I called Beth and she picked up. I hysterically asked if Jeff was there and she said that they had been out to eat and he was currently getting the Hardy Boys tattoo on the back of his neck filled in at Shannon's shop. I frantically explained what was happening and that he had to get there now. The first thing Jeff said was, "Matt, can you kick down the door and get Jack? Please, Matt, get Jack." It was heartbreaking. I told Jeff that it was too late. Everything was gone. The fire had destroyed everything. By the time I returned to the scene, the fire department was there and they were fighting the fire. There were fire trucks and police and emergency vehicles everywhere. It looked like some scene out of a movie. When Jeff and Beth finally arrived, the shock of reality truly set in on them. I have never felt so bad and helpless and powerless for two people before in my life. It took the firefighters until almost 4 a.m. to put out the flames. With the exception of the clothes on their bodies, everything that Jeff and Beth had owned had been destroyed. But the most tragic loss to them was their beloved dog, Jack. Jeff and Beth were crushed. If you've ever been extremely close to a pet, you know how painful it is to lose them. It's like the pet becomes your child. As a former pet owner myself, he is 100% right. It's one of the reasons I will never own another one. I've lost 2, and that is just, it's awful, and it's just something I don't ever want to go through ever again. 3 years ago this week, on March 15, 2018, in a spectacular PR blunder of their own making, after announcing on Raw the inaugural Fabulous Moolah Memorial Battle Royal for WrestleMania 34, by Thursday of that week, WWE reversed course after getting a ton of backlash on social media and changed the name to the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal. They issued a statement that read, "After further consideration, we believe it is best to proceed with the name WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal. What remains most important is that this historic match is part of WWE's unwavering commitment to the women's division." Stephanie McMahon, who founded, if you listen to WWE, I mean, she founded all things women. Stephanie McMahon created woman from the rib of Eve or some shit. I don't know. Anyway, Stephanie put something on Twitter that said, "Thank you, WWE Universe, for using your voice. What remains most important is that the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal will be a historic match and is part of our unwavering commitment to our women's division. Hashtag Women's Evolution. Hashtag Change the Name. I love how she put hashtag Change the Name. Like, you caused this in the first place. And now it's like she's tweeting out hashtags like she's like the leader of some great movement. More than 10,000 fans signed a change.org petition to change the name, and more importantly than any stupid online petition, which rarely works, the real reason this got changed wasn't some dinky little petition. It was Mars. Mars Incorporated, not the planet, but Mars Incorporated, although I think some of these people sometimes with their decisions are on the fucking planet Mars. Mars, which owns Snickers, which was the lead sponsor of WrestleMania that year, issued a statement. This was before they made the decision to change the name. You could trace one to the other. Mars said, as a principle-based business that has long championed creating inclusive environments that encourage and empower everyone to reach their full potential, this is unacceptable. We are engaging with the WWE to express our disappointment. That is the real reason that the name of that battle royal got changed. You have an angry sponsor. That is something they are not going to ignore. Naming the thing after Moolah was gross. I mean, it was just... What did they think was going to possibly come out of this? Naming it after her was gross. Her history of exploiting a lot of the female wrestlers that she trained, it was already well documented. It wasn't like it was some giant secret. I mean... And it only resurfaced after they made the announcement. So I have no idea how anybody in that company could have possibly thought this would be a good idea. You had Mad Maxine, who trained briefly with Moolah. She had this to say when contacted by Pro Wrestling Sheet about this whole story. The Fabulous Moolah was a real-life heel. A lot of women paid to train at her school and then went out on the road. They risked life and limb in their matches, and she repaid them with the worst kinds of abuses. She skimmed their money, she ignored women who were badly hurt, she pimped women out to creepy men, and on and on. She was not a mother figure, she was more like Kali, the Indian goddess of destruction. I met her in my early 20s, and I had never met such a monstrous person. I was smart enough to get the hell away from her and start my own independent career in Tampa as part of the Championship Wrestling from Florida. Luna Vachon, Peggy Fowler, and I all left together, which I hope put a serious dent in her confidence, if not wallet. I understand why Moolah was so grotesque. Her family was dirt poor, and she determined that she was never going to be hungry again. But it doesn't excuse her dog-eat-dog behavior. I'd much rather see WWE establish a match named for outstanding wrestlers and decent human beings, like Susan Tex Green, Beverly Shade, Leilani Kai, Wendy Richter, Princess Victoria, or Joyce Grable. They all put their hearts and souls into wrestling for decades and helped others along the way, but wrestling isn't PC. It's about generating heat. And you can't draw more heat than naming a match for the Fabulous Moolah. May she be the last of her kind. And 1 year ago, on March 18th, 2020, AEW hosted its first pandemic episode of Dynamite from Daly's Place in Jacksonville. This was supposed to be the company's debut in Rochester, New York, and it really sucks that it wasn't, because it was the show that featured the AEW debut of Rochester's own Brodie Lee as the Exalted One of the Dark Order. Show also featured the AEW debut of Broken Matt Hardy and Vanguard One at the end of the night. Hardy was to have been the fifth man joining the Elite against the Inner Circle the following week in Newark, New Jersey for their first ever Blood and Guts match, which was basically going to be their version of War Games. A cage enveloping two rings side by side. But and it never happened. Obviously the match never took place, but I do think that we are going to get that Blood and Guts match in the next few months with the Inner Circle and MJF's new group, The Pinnacle. I think it's coming. Now, if they want to wait and do it in Newark and give the people of Newark the match they were promised, that show has been rescheduled to September 15th. And they might actually be able to run Newark and get something of a crowd by then. We'll see. I just don't know if they want to wait that long. That's all. They just started this program on TV this past week. September, I don't know. September's still a ways off. I don't know if they want to wait that long. And that is this very busy week in wrestling history.